Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of This Naked Voice. My name's Joey, and I'm really glad to have you back for this episode. So, I want you for a moment, if you'll indulge me, to just think back in your life and imagine if you were lucky enough to have a childhood friend who was a best friend, a super close, meaningful friend that you consider to be an integral part of your childhood, someone who made you who you are, who you can't imagine your childhood without. Think about who they are. Think about what they mean to you. And think about how you met them. Think about the circumstances in childhood that led you to meet this friend. Maybe it was in school. Maybe it was on the playground. Maybe they lived down the street. Or maybe you met them on a bike ride or at camp one summer. But how did you meet them? And just imagine all the weird and strange little circumstances that exist in childhood that unfold to allow us to meet the people who become our best friends, that end up shaping our lives forever. My guest on this podcast is that person for me. In his adult life, he's a professor of philosophy and a podcast host of a podcast named The Relentless Picnic. The thing is, no matter who he is as an adult, he'll always be my best friend since 7th grade. And though over time we've grown apart and grown back together and grown apart and grown together, there's always been a through line of deep love between us. And in this short episode here, I think you might get a taste of why that is and the reason that is, just in the way that we can interact, the things we can talk about. But I was reflecting on what was the reason that Erikk G, my guest tonight, and I became friends. And it all happened because the second day of 7th grade in social studies class, a girl named Christine Mazzarino asked Mr. Cricchio, who was our teacher, who looked a lot like Tony Danza, and the jury's still out on whether or not he actually was related to Tony Danza or not. Christine said, "Mr. Cricchio, I can't see the board from back here. Can I switch seats with someone in the front of the class?" And I was in the front of the class, and I said, "I'll switch seats." And so I went to the back of the class, and I ended up in the back left corner, the very back left seat, and didn't think anything of it. And so we went on with the day. The very next day, I come into social studies class, it was like first or second period, and I sit down at that desk. And before I could even get my books out of my bag, the kid in front of me turns around and he says to me, "I'm writing a story, and you're in it." And I remember instantly feeling excited and flattered and curious. And that kid was Erikk G. He didn't know me at all, but he decided this kid, Joey Cardella, is going to be in my story. And the story is about an insane teacher named Miss Fland, and she was doing all these diabolical things to, I don't know, she was taking over the world, or I actually can't remember what she was doing, but it was diabolical, trust me. And Erikk and I were out to foil her plans over time. And I don't know if he still has it. I'm sure he still has a story somewhere. But that was how I met Erikk, because he had the courage and the imagination to say, "I'm going to put this kid in my story, the kid behind me in social studies class." To this day, I have no idea why. And actually, I forgot to ask him about it on the podcast, but maybe that's a question I should ask in the future. But this episode is not about Miss Fland or 7th grade or anything like that. This episode is just a quick introduction to Erikk and to the types of conversations that he and I have enjoyed having over the years. It gives a little introduction to our relationship, and you get a taste for his character. And the reason I made this episode short is because the next episode is a deeper dive into a lot tougher and more vulnerable territory between two old friends. I hope enough comes through in this conversation to accurately portray just a piece of what makes Erikk so special to me. And I hope it maybe brings up someone in your life, someone special who you could have conversations with about absolutely anything, who you could explore philosophical questions and topics like the origins of the universe and time and truth and fear and puppets, right? Because why not? Erikk is someone who I'm never afraid or embarrassed that I'm going to make mistakes around or sound stupid around. He's someone who I've always reached out to when I didn't know something, when I was curious to explore something, and I still do today. I trust his intellect, I trust his heart, and I always trust that he's going to make me laugh. We've grown together, we've grown apart, and we've grown back together again, but he's always been invaluable to me. So here's a setup for a much deeper conversation in the next episode. So I hope you'll stick around for both. And without further ado, we get into this episode dropping in somewhere on the topic of what came first, something or nothing, with Erikk G. Man, it's amazing to me how, an hour and a half, 2 hours on the phone with you freaking flies by.
I know.
I don't understand that happens. Yeah, I mean, over time, I text you things that pop up that I mean to dig into. I'm like, I don't even there's just so
You went wide last time, man. I gotta be honest, I didn't know what the fuck to do with that.
Yeah, what did I talk about?
Well, you asked me one of the biggest philosophical questions, which was, did nothing have to exist before something, or did something have to exist before nothing?
Yeah. Okay. How did I get there?
That's kind of a nice feeling.
Did nothing?
You got to the edge, man.
Have to exist.
That's the very edge.
Yeah. Okay. So get this. Okay. See if this makes sense. And this comes back to this starts with the idea of, imagining we are more than biological machines.
Yes.
Which is true. I think, no doubt, we are more than biological machines, right? Consciousness comes from somewhere, and if so, is there a source of consciousness? I don't know. It seems to be that in the language that I've heard and that I tend to use, people speak of source, as in everything goes back to source or comes from source, or just the word source in itself indicates an origin, right? Like some place of beginning, right? And so that's kind of where this thought came from. The idea of whether we talk about spiritual beings, consciousness, the nature of the universe and all its workings, quantum science and all this unknown, right? Coming from some sort of source. And if many sources, then did they all come from a source? Like, can there be more than one source, or can there only be one source?
There definitely can be more than one source, it seems to me.
So if there's more than one source, then where did they come from?
Yeah,
right.
That's right. Where's the first cause?
Right, and that's kind of and that's that age old where did time start sort of thing. But
right.
And my thought is, if there's many sources, eventually, I think things have to go back to one source. And even just the fact that there is a source, to me, indicates that that something, being source, has to exist before nothing, the concept of nothing, has to exist. Like source can't come from nothing.
Yeah, there's got to be a something. What Aristotle calls the prime mover, the first mover. In order to set all these things into motion, there seems logically, metaphysically, philosophically to be the need for there to be some kind of pre-existing first pusher of the of things into motion, which might have led to the multiplicity that has like woven us into the kind of fabric of multiple things that we experience ourselves to be. It seems, I mean, it's pretty mystical, because I mean, one of the things I wanted to say when you were talking is like one of the problems with being human beings, limited temporally as we are, and talking about origins of things, is that one of the things that we think it's reasonable to talk about the origin of is temporality, is time. And then you get twisted up. How do you talk about the origin of time in time? No, that doesn't make sense. The thing that we're talking about is the origin of temporality. So we must mean something else other than time when we talk about the origin of something, right? Which is why in I don't, not to, this isn't an Aristotle lesson, but for your first Aristotle lesson, the word that he uses for source in Greek is more like cause than it is like origin. It is less temporal in meaning. The aitia in Greek is the cause of things, and it's more of a primacy in order than it is an originality in time. And so we should be able to look at the universe and sort of think about sources and in terms of first principles that are always active, not like what happened longest ago, but what is the most fundamental sort of source or dwelling point for being in the world, or something like that. That's a way to talk about the structure of things and the origins without talking about it as origin in time, because then we're really just talking about like if there was a camera on the universe, what would it see from way back when? And that's to me a less interesting question than like, because the question that motivated you into this problem, it sounds like, is we are on the one hand biological entities, on the other hand we're clearly spiritual or psychic entities. So whence those two things? How did they come to confluence in ourselves, right?
And yeah, well, I mean, that's a whole nother issue of, you know, the reason that we come into these biological bodies to begin with. Like there's, you know, the reasons that we enter into this earthly realm as humans. But the idea that, you know, I always try to get to the bottom line of almost anything. That's like one of my driving forces of curiosity. It is like, what's the underneath that? What's underneath that? What's the bottom of this all? And trying to get to the idea of source, the idea that like nothingness seems really scary. The idea that there can be a nothingness, but the fact that nothingness is a product of source, that it's come out of something, makes it less scary because it's come from source. It's come from
and so something. It's not really nothing in some deeper way, right?
It has a purpose, at least. It's like there's not like, I remember one of the scariest moments of my life was imagining dropping into an infinite nothingness forever, an eternal nothingness. That's beyond frightening. But it just doesn't make as much sense when understanding that nothingness has a purpose, like emptiness or nothing. Like nothing has a purpose in the sense that it comes from source. Mm-hmm. But if something came from nothing, I'd be like a little more like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean it's one of two things, three things. First of all, there used to be a spot in my bathroom in my childhood home, like a piece of metal, that when I would touch it, I would think about that very problem of like, what if there was nothing? What if everything was just nothing? And I would like go into the bathroom as a kid and look at that spot and be like, and say to myself like, You want to do it? You know what I mean? Like, just be like, because I felt like if I could touch this cold metal like towel rack, I think is what it was, long enough, then I would just really get to that like glazed over place of like, oh my god, and like feel that terror of what if there was what if there was nothing. So that's just a window. I've never actually like articulated that before, but it's a significant piece of evidence that there is something in support of the theory that you're advancing, which is that ultimately we need less fear the nothingness that exists, because even if it does exist, it is sourced by a something, and the primary piece of evidence that you have for that is here the fuck something is. There is being, and it didn't have to be. So that there is really seems to indicate that there may have always been in some degree, right? And also, I have some atheist friends who, I mean, militant atheism is one of my least favorite things in the world, because militant dogmatism really of any kind annoys me. And what annoys me most about the militant dogmatism of atheism is that they purport to be against militant dogmatism. Anyway, but I have these militant atheist friends who are like ridicule Big Bang cosmology, you know, like the idea that like the Big Bang was the start of the universe, or ridicule the idea of divine creation because it's not Big Bang cosmology is what I mean to say. Like they abhor the religious idea of divine creation because really the scientific story to them is quite clear, and it is the Big Bang. Now as far as models of the creation of the universe go, the Big fucking Bang is pretty compatible with divine creation, just if we were going to match them all up or whatever. You're saying there was a microscopic, super dense ball of everything, and it blew up, cause unknown, into everything that exists. That actually sounds quite comportable with divine creation to me. And even in that theory, there's the question of, well, how was there that super dense ball of everything, right? To support your theory that there does seem to be, even in your best cosmological theories, there seems to have been a conception of being before there was a conception of non-being. I feel this more too as I get older, that the unity of all these different, seemingly different endeavors, you know, what always felt like a very segregated line between like philosophical wonderings about the origin of the universe and more cosmological formulations of the math of the origin of the universe in terms of like the cosmological forces at play that we observe through instruments of detection of, anyway, like it's all the same endeavor. Mm-hmm. We're all asking the same questions. It's one of my fundamental beliefs in study, I guess.
Which is why I hate, like that you said, that militant dogmatism. Yeah. Because it neglects the idea of like we're all trying to get to the same answers in a way. It says like you don't fucking know. You just you're. It's like no, we're all trying to get to the same answers. To say like you're totally wrong, or to totally discount an entire lineage of history and knowledge seems short-sighted.
It's dumb.
It's super dumb. Let's just say it's super
bad,
dumb.
That's just bad moves. Yeah.
Right. And it's not, and that's not to say like, yeah, maybe certain human elements of religions are arguably not helpful in certain other fields. Cool. Doesn't mean that we need to discount them entirely in terms of our search for answers.
Well, and exactly. And this is related to another question you asked me recently. Like, telling the truth is a very serious and important endeavor and ought to be taken extremely seriously. It is not a cavalier thing to like issue a truth about how you think the world works. You're going to need all the tools in your toolbox for that very difficult project of saying true things about the world. The things that we're really good at is not saying true things about the world. It's mostly saying things that work, that seem practicable, or that appear true. We're really good at that. That's much easier. You don't have to worry so much about that. And that's most of the claims that anyone makes are claims like that. But the enterprises of philosophy and religion and science all throughout the years have tried really hard to come up with more everlasting truths. And for thousands of years, science was seen as the handmaiden to the study of philosophy and an assistant along the way to the already ongoing enterprise of trying to arrive at the most fundamental truths of things, which long predates what we think of as modern empirical science. And the idea that we would just suddenly sort of throw all that deference and respect out the window and artificially limit who gets to say truths is ridiculous to me. And I think even the modest student of the history of science and philosophy would come to that understanding like you just articulated. Not to say that all religion is true. This is a very, very different claim I'm making. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying we have to fucking deal with life, the fullness of it, all of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought about it in a different way recently, where, you know, when we are born as humans and when other creatures are born as other creatures, we have certain instincts that lead us to orient ourselves in the world in any number of ways. But essentially, every day that we're on this planet, our instincts and our learnings about our environment, they're all oriented towards helping us understand what is true. Right? Like mm-hmm. when I move my body in this way, this happens. Okay, so there is some element of truth about when this happens, this happens. When I put this up to my mouth and I do like this happens when that, okay, so there's an element, there's a cause and effect here, like there's a chain of events, like there's a pattern recognition and there's a logical sequence. There's like, okay, I'm seeking truth in every action that I take, in every behavior that I engage in. And other creatures do too, to some extent. Not as, I don't think, actively, consciously as we do as humans, as far as we know. But yeah. Every creature orients itself to some sort of truth. Here's the nut that is good for my body. So I go and I seek out this nut and I eat this nut. Like that's the good. That's the bad nut. So I don't eat that nut. That nut killed my dad. So I don't eat that nut. Okay. So this is the good nut, right? Whatever it is. So in some way, like we're truth-seeking creatures, like by nature. And some creatures are only truth-seeking creatures. What will help me survive and pass on my genetic material? Like that's it. That's their search for truth. And what's I think unique about humans is the fact that we are not only truth-seeking creatures. We seek not only what is true, we also wonder what can be. Like that's where creation comes into play.
Yeah, I mean, I have never been another creature. And so, like all human beings, I have to judge non-human beings sort of by extrapolating what you observe them do and sort of we posit an interior life. It's not actually all that different than how we deal with other human beings. We do the same sort of thing. We see them like seeming to furrow their brow and you're like, oh, okay, they're probably feeling a thing. And, you know, that's why they did that. As opposed to they're a complicated robot designed to fool me, right? So it's a safe bet that these creatures are doing the kind of mental activity that you describe. It's funny, though. To me, truth seems, it does seem different and more universal than simply like, what is the nut I need to survive? Because it actually, in terms of like classifying the nuts and berries into like what's poisonous and what's not, basically humans do that.
They do. Go on.
And I don't read. We're killing it in terms of coming to like universal claims about how things are. Whether the bees and the squirrels are doing that, I don't really have access to it. But one other way that I could put it to elevate truth a little bit to be the sphere of human beings would be to say that we're after truths that are sort of enduring and universal and more permanently the case than simply what is before us and what is in front of us. Whereas the animals seem to be really concerned with basically what's in front of them and like you said, survival. Mm-hmm. Right? Truth can be seen as a luxury of those who don't have to wonder about their survival all the time. As opposed, because if I'm just worried about survival, then I'm probably a very practical person. It doesn't actually matter about truth. It just really matters is what's going to get me to the next day. So that would just be another way to say that I think this same sort of hierarchy that you laid out. But if we want to reserve truth for us, as I sort of do, it seems like, that's how I would put it. Because the squirrels, I don't think are after truth. I think they're after nuts.
Well, every creature is after survival, right?
But we do survival plus is part of your point.
We do survival plus, and we do survival plus because we've gotten to a place where survival has become relatively easy. We don't struggle as much as we used to as a species. I mean, obviously there are people who are struggling all over the world, but
it's crucial to the fact, to what you're saying, that the search for truth comes once the struggle for survival can chill out a bit.
Yeah, and I think that's when consciousness evolution really kind of kicks up a notch.
Yeah. One of the things that the author Jean-Jacques Rousseau imagines, not based on much evidence, just based on his own little brain, he imagines how our human ancestors used to be. And one of the things that he says is, like, I imagine them basically just like focusing on meeting their present needs in front of them. And as a result of that fact, they weren't curious, because in order to be curious, you have to literally think into the future.
Right.
And thinking into the future can only come when you're not concerned with meeting your needs in the present. And so if you can't even be curious, then you're never going to be interested in truth. And if you can't be curious without thinking into the future, and you can't think into the future without having your survival needs chilled out, then yeah, I agree with you.
That's all Maslow's hierarchy.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Right. Because there are people who want to, who over time will be like, we should really offer these self-help weekends to like the homeless and all these destitute populations.
Wow, yeah,
and
right.
We're like, love where your heart's at, but like, no.
We need to give them food, and housing,
and food and basics. Like, they don't care. Like,
That's such an interesting problem. Yeah,
like well-meaning people who just don't understand this hierarchy of, like, people aren't interested in transcending their self because they don't know where they're gonna get breakfast or lunch or dinner, or like where they're gonna shit. Right. Like, these are basic human needs they don't have. So yeah, like, they can't think about the future because they're worried about the present.
That's such an interesting. It's so, I can like imagine that person at the meeting thinking they have such a good idea, and like you said, like, love where your heart's at, but Cheryl, listen.
We want to both thank Cheryl for her input, but we're going to move on to other topics now. So this conversation was recorded back in June, and Erikk and I spoke 2 weekends, and we recorded over 4.5 hours worth of audio. So getting these conversations cut down was no small task, because there's so much that I actually want to share, and I also never know what's actually interesting for other people to hear. I hope that this conversation was informative and entertaining in some way for you, and I hope that it gave you enough to want to stick around for the next conversation, because it goes a lot deeper, and it was a tougher conversation for both Erikk and I, but it was also really healing. The conversation centers a lot around the issue of shame and vulnerability, and how shame has gotten in the way of us deepening our relationship as adults.
I isolate myself. I'm embarrassed and ashamed when I'm at my worst. I'm putting more walls up around me because I'm trying to convince myself that I have to get myself out of this rut, that I can't enter certain arenas, right? And it always is isolating, and it always comes with not having the courage to answer the phone and talk to people about how terrible I'm doing.
You can check out Erikk's podcast anywhere podcasts are available. Just search for The Relentless Picnic. And come on back next time for a juicy and vulnerable conversation on This Naked Voice. Till then, be good to yourself.